Where does our food come from? Of course, the meats that we eat almost every day come from a farm, but it probably isn't the kind of farm that you were imagining when I asked that question. Many large factory farms that produce the meat we eat every single day have very questionable and sometimes torturous methods to mass produce meat while also making the highest profit possible. Hello, my name is Addie Knacker, and today I will be talking about Alistair Norcross's view on factory farming. He uses the following premises to argue that factory farming is a negative and that we should not support it. The Fred argument by analogy, the ignorance or knowledge objection and the indirect objection, the casual impotence objection and the moose objection by analogy, and lastly, the rationality gambit and the problem with marginal cases. In the following, I will explain all of these arguments and analogies and why he uses them to argue against factory farming. Norcross starts his argument with an analogy. Imagine a man named Fred, and Fred really loves chocolate. One day, Fred was going to the grocery store to get some, and he suffered a car accident. In the car accident, he was greatly injured, especially his brain capacity. This car crash made him lose his function of his Godiva gland, which is the gland in his brain that allowed Fred to taste chocolate. Fred couldn't taste the chocolate anymore, with his Godiva gland being wrecked, and it very much affected him. Although Fred knows that it's probably wrong to torture puppies, he still does it for his own personal benefit to be able to taste chocolate again. After a while, his neighbors find out that he is torturing these puppies in his basement, and they call the police. When the police come, they discover 20 puppies being tortured in his basement, being kept in small cages and being mutilated from their bodies. Fred is then arrested by these police because they are appalled at what they see. When he goes to court, he argues that he technically did nothing wrong because, compared to factory farming, he did the exact same thing. After stating this analogy, Norcross goes on to talk about different ways of factory farming that they torture animals. He explains that many pigs in America are kept in such small spaces and they can't move around, which leads to them showing signs of depression. He also talks about the mutilation of cows, such as how they are not numbed and still feel pain when they are being branded or when their ears are being marked for identification. The last animal that Norcross includes in his argument is chickens. Chickens are the most factory farmed animal in the United States. Chickens in factory farms are debeaked with absolutely no pain medication or numbing and are kept in large sheds but at a very high population, whereas they cannot spread out their wings or move around, as well as they are constantly kept in the excrements on the floor. The excrement on the floor that the chickens can never escape gives them sores or respiratory issues. Norcross uses an analogy with the puppies to compare real-life farming practices with factory farming to show at what point does the benefit of a human, either getting food or being able to taste chocolate, outweigh the right to life and comfort of these animals in factory farming. Overall, Norcross's analogy shows that factory farming is not morally correct. Just as no one should torture puppies for their own personal enjoyment, like Fred was torturing the puppies so he could taste chocolate again, no one should factory farm animals for any purpose, and mainly for the use of humans just so they can eat meat at an inexpensive price. The next objection that Norcross brings up is the ignorance or knowledge objection and the indirect objection. These objections are the most common and begs the question, what if you were unaware that the meat that you were consuming or buying came from a factory farm? Norcross basically claims that past purchase or support of these factory farms would be morally okay, but in the future, it would not be okay for a person to consume meat from a factory farm or buy meat from a factory farm supporting it financially. Norcross's claim that ignorance in the past would be morally acceptable, but once one knows about the idea of factory farming and what they are consuming and where it comes from, it is not okay in the present or future to support these factory farms by consuming or buying factory farmed meat. To go along with this, one might argue that because they are not directly involved in torture or bad treatment of these factory farmed animals, that it is okay for them to purchase or consume factory farmed meat. Norcross argues that although one might not be directly involved in torturing animals through factory farming, consuming or buying meat is still financially supporting these factory farms, which allows them to continue their processes and continue torturing animals. Next, Norcross supports his argument with the casual impotence objection and the moose objection by analogy. The casual impotence objection talks about how if one person thinks that if they change their ways of life, that it won't make that much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. Norcross argues that that is true. If one person only changes what they're doing, then it won't make that much of a difference. But if everyone who was having those thoughts that they wanted to change but weren't because it wasn't going to make a difference, if everyone who had that thought changed, then it could add up to a substantial number that would end up actually making a huge change in the practices of factory farming. Norcross uses the example that if only one person were to not eat chicken for a year, which the average person consumes about 25 chickens a year, that would only be 25 chickens that were not bought through factory farming. But if 10,000 people did this, which seems like a big number, but in comparison to the United States population, is very small. That would be 250,000 chickens that were not consumed, which would have a major impact on the livelihood of factory farming. The second part to this is the moose objection by analogy. This basically states a situational example where, imagine you're at dinner and you just had the most delicious pasta that you ever had in your life. After that settles, you want some dessert. So you ordered the chocolate cake with mousse. Imagine that this cake is the best thing you have ever tasted, so good that you ask your waitress to have the chef come out so you can ask him how he made it so good. Once the chef comes out, he tells you that the reason it tastes so good was because he was torturing puppies. Norcross uses this example to ask the question, is it morally okay to continue eating the cake? You already started eating it, and it was already made before you even knew that it involved torturing puppies. Norcross basically states through this example that although the cake was already made and that you had already eaten part of it, it is still morally wrong to continue to eat the cake that was made through torturing puppies. Lastly, Norcross talks about the rationality gambit and the problem of marginal cases. Norcross lastly argues that animals do not have the same rights as humans, since humans have a higher capacity than animals. Norcross responds to this by stating that there are humans, such as infants or severely senile or disabled humans, that do not have the same capacity as the average human, which begs the question, do they have the same rights as a human or an animal? Obviously, one would say that a severely incapacitated, possibly person in a coma, very old, or an infant would have the same rights as any other human who is cognitively able. Norcross ends with this example to show that animals should have the same rights as humans, and we should not support factory farming since it is morally unethical. In conclusion, factory farming is becoming increasingly relevant in our society. At what point do we as humans decide that we need to do something to stop it? Norcross provides his opinions and premises as to why he thinks factory farming is morally unethical through not only situational examples and analogies, but also providing rebuttals to ones who might not agree with his opinions. Overall, Norcross provides a sound argument as to why factory farming is morally wrong.